Hello. Time for more and Carson. Last time I think I finished with losing the edge. Yes, losing the edge. And I am struck it's been a few days, and I'm really struck by how much like a Corona sonnet sequence this text is, because she ends every chapter with every chapter starts with this notion and then explores and spirals and digs down and veers off and wins its way through her logic to a conclusion that is so much a culmination of thinking. And she usually ends up picking up that idea and starting the next chapter with it. But as I went back to look through, I noticed it was chapter 7 and 8, which is so unhelpful because she doesn't actually number her chapters at all. But I was counting. I was oh, great, we get to start with losing the edge. I love the beginning of this one. The self forms at the edge of desire, and a science of self arises in the effort to leave that self behind. But that was chapter 8. I couldn't at all imagine that we'd really jumped into that. But we had. Anyway, I know that she's going to come back to the points that she made at the end of chapter 8. Which were really important. And I sort of want to reread the very last paragraph. So whatever, I'm going to. All right. Okay, the very last paragraph of Losing the Edge. The presence or absence of literacy affects the way a person regards his own body, senses, and self. That effect will significantly influence erotic life. It is in the poetry of those who were first exposed to a written alphabet and the demands of literacy that we encounter deliberate. I remember reading this last time because I kept stumbling over effect, deliberates or deliberates, and Carson and her intentional word play. I kept misreading them, and I did it again this time. So I'm going to start over. And then I swear I'm going to go to chapter 9 and chapter 10, which are Archilochos at the edge and Alphabetic edge. Okay. If the presence or absence of literacy affects the way a person regards his own body, senses, and self, that effect will significantly influence erotic life. It is in the poetry of those who are first exposed to a written alphabet and the demands of literacy that we encounter deliberate meditation upon the self, especially in the context of erotic desire. The singular intensity with which these poets insist on conceiving Eros as lack may reflect, in some degree, that exposure. Literate training encourages a heightened awareness of personal, physical boundaries and a sense of those boundaries as the vessel of one's self. To control the boundaries is to possess oneself. For individuals to whom self-possession has become important, the influx of a sudden, strong emotion from without cannot be an unalarming event, as it may be in an oral environment, where such incursions are the normal conductors of most of the important information that a person receives. When an individual appreciates that he alone is responsible for the content and coherence of his person, an influx like Eros becomes a concrete personal threat. So in the lyric poets, love is something that assaults or invades the body of the lover to wrest control of it from him. A personal struggle of will and physique between the god and his victim. The poets record this struggle from within a consciousness, perhaps new in the world, of the body as a unity of limbs, senses, and self, amazed at its own vulnerability. Archilochos at the edge. Archilochos is the first lyric poet whose transmission to us benefited from the literate revolution. Although evidence for the chronology of both poet and alphabet is uncertain, it is most plausible that, educated in the oral tradition, he encountered the new technology of writing at some point in his career and adapted himself to it. At any rate, someone, perhaps Archilochos himself, wrote down these early facts of what it feels like to be violated by Eros. When she says violated, of course, she's like calling up all these notions of I don't know, she's like thinking about like notions of like rape and of like bodily violation. Words, please, they're not that hard. I mean, they are really that hard, but she's calling up these notions of like incursions on the self physically. She's imagining that feeling of the self being assaulted as a physical thing, though of course it's all like internal, and I don't want to say figurative. Figurative sounds wrong, but internal, about a feeling of consciousness, the way that we imagine ourself as this conscious, separate mind being entity. This is why I should just read. Anyway, so Archilochos himself, someone, perhaps Archilochos himself, wrote down these early facts of what it feels like to be violated by Eros. Such a longing for love rolled itself up under my heart, poured down much mist over my eyes, filching out of my chest the soft lungs, like having like pulling out. And I just got this, oh wow, I just like had two mental pictures. One was of the Florence and the Machine album cover. Really, I think her chest is like laid bare. I shouldn't make this face about it, but anyway, I love the image. Another that wasn't what just came to mind before, but another is this like picture, Frida Kahlo, like depictions of herself with her like chest splayed open, her ribs like splayed open, or her skin splayed open, seeing through to her like ribs and heart. And I'm also having this picture, and that's what causes me like, whoa. This picture of this play called Seawall, where that emblem and the blurring of the lines between felt, mental states and impacts, and like the couching that through like physical terms and asking us to imagine it as a physical marker. Anyway, all that stuff sort of collected around that, but filching out of my chest the soft lungs. The first word of the poem initiates a correlation. The word toios is a demonstrative pronoun meaning such, which properly corresponds to the relative pronoun hoios, meaning as, so that a sentence beginning toios expects an answering clause with hoios to complete the thought. Sort of like if then, but this is like such and as, but that sort of like connecting, or that sort of connection. The poem sets out one half of this thought, then stops. So it'd be like having the if, and then never getting to the then. Nonetheless, it has a perfect economy as far as it goes. Every word, sound, and stress is placed for a purpose. The first verse describes Eros rolled up in a ball beneath the lover's heart. The words are ordered to reflect the physiology of the moment, with Eros coiled dead center. A sequence of round O sounds, 1 long and 5 short, and bunched consonants, 4 pairs, gather the tension of the lover's desire into an audible pressure within him. Consonants seem to be chosen for their insinuating quality, liquids, sibilants, and voiceless stops. she's asking us too to call back to this notion of like what it feels like to make sounds, to like make the sounds of different letters and letter combinations in our mouths, and to feel like what's happening when we're saying certain things. So the consonants that are chosen seem to be chosen for their insinuating qualities, the way that the sound and the sense work together. So cool. Liquids and sibilants and voiceless stops. The metrical pattern is an original mixture of dactylic and iambic units, combined in a way that imitates the action of desire. Launched in an epic burst of dactyls and spondees as Eros asserts its presence, the verse then dissolves into a spatter of iambs, precisely at the point where desire reaches the lover's heart. The last word of the verse is a participle that has an epic past. Rolled up in a ball under the belly of a ram is the mode in which Odysseus escapes the Cyclops' cave. Rolled up in a ball at the feet of Achilles is the position from which Priam makes supplication for the body of his son in the Iliad. In both of these epic contexts, a posture of abject vulnerability is assumed by a genuinely powerful person, who then proceeds to work his will on the enemy confronting him. Hidden power is a traditional feature of Eros too, in poetry and art, as the innocuous pice whose arrows proved deadly. Archilochos places the overtone of menace quietly, setting his participle at verse end, just as it occurs in both Homeric passages. Line 2 encloses the lover's eyes in mist from both sides. The poet's consonants soften and thicken with the fog to L, M, N, and chi sounds. Maybe chi sounds, but I think chi anyway. I do not read ancient Greek, let alone pronounce it. So whatever, CHI sounds. These sounds are doubled and combined in a repeated pattern that comes down 4 times upon word end in, as if emphasizing the descent of the fog on 4 liquid streaks, lane, loon, ton, and n. Fog is fused around the lover's eyes by the iambic rhythm of the verse, especially in the second metron, where the caesura is dropped between eyes and mist. Epic overtones of danger are again to be felt in the imagery, for in Homer, mist darkens a man's eyes at the moment of death. With line 3, Eros completes his violation. One quick theft whistles the lungs straight out of the lover's chest. Naturally, this ends the poem. With the organ of breath gone, speech is impossible. The robbery is staged in a run of S sounds, 5 of them, and the verse breaks off without completing its metrical scheme. The dactylic tetrameter should be followed by an iambic metron, as in line 1. Most likely, the break is a fault of transmission rather than a fault of the poet's intention. Either way, it's still good, right? Obviously, the same explanation, namely the fragmentary condition of Archilochos' text, would account for the unfulfilled syntactical expectation set up by the correlative pronoun with which the poem begins, the toios. On the other hand, it is a very careful poem as far as it goes. I promise I'm going to keep going and stop interrupting myself all the time to provide commentary. However, I love that Carson has just engaged in, she's done the work that we find so infuriating as readers of poetry. We don't find infuriating, but like usually not by the time we get to this text together in class, but often the first couple of times we encounter it together as a class, it is so frustrating to new readers of poetry or people for whom thinking about highly constructed language and text, to think about like, well, what was intentional, what wasn't. Like, she's leaning in like it's all intentional, while acknowledging that maybe it wasn't at all intentional, because ultimately it doesn't really matter. Like, the meaning is there and comes out. And if it were her only example, of course it would be bad, but it's not. So why would we ignore that entire text just because we can't be sure that this, what we have, is all that ever was? So what if it's a fragment? The incompleteness is how we have it. So Why shouldn't we note that the incompleteness is what matters? Anyway, I'll get into more of this later. Okay, the phrases of the lover are as far as it goes. I have translated this word lungs and referred to it as the organ of breath. What is breath? For the ancient Greeks, breath is consciousness. Breath is perception. Breath is emotion. The phrases seem to be roughly identifiable with the lungs in ancient physiological theory, and to contain the spirit of breath as it comes and goes. At this point, we probably will have read Milton already and probably talked about inspiration and spirare as the Latin root of that word and how it connects with the idea of breathing the breath of life into someone, so that like life, that like vital force, like vital vita, anyway, more fun etymology, but like that vital force that gets breathed into Adam in the creation, like the Judeo-Christian model, breathed in by God into this human form to make that man a living soul, to like to inspire spirit and spirare, and to breathe in, like all of those things are connected, so that of course like the seat of the lungs is really the seat of like being and consciousness. That those are the receptacles of the stuff that makes humans human, according to some of the earliest notions of creation and humanity. Okay. The chest is regarded by the Greeks as a receptacle of sense impressions and a vehicle for each of the five senses. Even vision for in seeing, something may be breathed from the object seen and received through the eyes of the seer. This notion of like breathing something out, and it's like actually something, and that something isn't like breathed in by someone else, but it is like received through the eyes and imprints on the brain. It's very fascinating. Words, thoughts, and understanding are both received and produced by the phrases. So words are winged in Homer when they are kept in the phrases unspoken, in Homer when they issue from the speaker, and unwinged when they are kept in the phrases unspoken. The phrases are organs of mind. As Theognis says, the eyes and tongue and ears and intelligence of a quick-witted man grow in the middle of his chest. And he's not talking about the heart. Such a conception is natural among people in an oral environment. Breath is primary insofar as the spoken word is. The conception has a solid psychological and sensual basis on the daily experience of these people. For the inhabitants of an oral society live much more intimately blended with their surroundings than we do. Space and the distances between things are not of first importance. These are aspects emphasized by the visual sense. What is vital in a world of sound is to maintain continuity. This attitude pervades archaic poetry and is strikingly present as well in the perceptual theories of the ancient physiologoi. Empedocles' celebrated doctrine of emancipations, for example, Empedocles' celebrated doctrine of emanations, for example, maintains that everything in the universe is perpetually inhaling and exhaling small particles called aporoi in a constant stream. All sensations are caused by these emanations as they are breathed in and out through the whole skin surface of living beings. The aporoi are mediators of perception, which allow everything in the universe to be potentially in touch with everything else. Empedocles and his contemporaries posit a universe where the spaces between things are ignored and the interactions constant. Breath is everywhere. There are no edges. The breath of desire is Eros, inescapable as the environment itself. With his wings, he moves love in and out of all creatures at will. The individual's total vulnerability to erotic influence is symbolized by those wings with their multi-sensual power to permeate and take control of a lover at any moment. Wings and breath transport Eros as wings, and wings and breath transport Eros as wings and breath convey words. An ancient analogy between language and love is here apparent. The same irresistible sensual charm, called paito in Greek, is the mechanism of seduction in love and of persuasion in words. The same goddess attends upon seducer and poet. It is an analogy that makes perfect sense in the context of oral poetics, where Eros and the Muses clearly share an apparatus of sensual assault. A listener listening to an oral recitation is, as Hermann Frankl puts it, an open force field, into whom sounds are being breathed in a continuous stream from the poet's mouth. Written words, on the other hand, do not present such an all-persuasive sensual phenomenon. Literacy desensorializes words and readers. Literacy desensorializes words and reader. A reader must disconnect himself from the influx of sense impressions transmitted by nose, ear, tongue, and skin if he is to concentrate upon his reading. A written text separates words from one another, separates words from the environment, separates words from the reader or writer, and separates the reader or writer from his environment. Separation is painful. The evidence of epigraphy shows how long it takes people to systematize word division in writing, indicating the novelty and difficulty of this concept. As separable, controllable units of meaning, each with its own visible boundary, each with its own fixed and independent use, written words project their user into isolation. That words have edges is an insight most vivid then for the reader or writer of them. Heard words may have no edges or varying edges. Oral traditions may have no concept of word as a fixed and bounded vocable, or may employ a flexible concept. Homer's word for word, epos, includes the meanings speech, tale, song, line of verse, or epic poetry as a whole. So a word or an entire epic poem. One word meant those things, and all ranges in between for Homer. All are breathable. The edges are irrelevant. But edge has a clear relevance for Archilochos. His words stop in mid-breath. A poet like Archilochos, says the historian Werner Jaeger, has learnt how to express in his own personality the whole objective world and its laws, to represent them in himself. From the flesh out, what is a flesh out? From the flesh out, it seems, Archilochos understands the law differentiating self from not self, for Eros cuts into him just at the point where that difference lies. To know desire, to know words, is for Archilochos a matter of perceiving the edge between one entity and another. It is fashionable to say that this is true of any utterance. In language, there are only differences, Saussure tells us, meaning that phonemes are characterized not by their positive qualities, but by the fact that they are distinct. Yet the individuality of words must be especially felt by someone for whom written phonemes are a novelty, and the edges of words newly precise. In the next section, we will observe the Greek alphabet at very close range and consider how its special genius is linked to a special sensibility about edges. But for the moment, let us view the phenomenon of the archaic writer from a wider angle. In Archilochos and the other archaic poets, we see people struck by new ways of thinking about edges, the edges of sounds, letters, words, emotions, events in time, selves. This is apparent in the way they use the materials of poetry, as well as in the things they say. Contraction and focus are the mechanism of lyric procedure. The sweep of epic narrative contracts upon a moment of emotion. The cast of characters is pared down to one ego. The poetic I enters its subject in a single beam, and it's EYE, not I, although when I read EYE, you hear the letter I, and that is intentional. Carson. The poetic I enters its subject in a single beam. Comes a sigh of admiration. The diction and meter of these poets seem to represent a systematic breakup of the huge flows of Homer's poetic system. Epic formulas of phrase and rhythm pervade lyric poetry, but they are broken apart and differently assembled in irregular shapes and joints. A poet like Archilochos shows himself master of such combinations, sharply aware of the boundary between his own and epic procedure. We saw how deftly he fastens dactylic to iambic units in the first verse of fragment 191, so that Eros hits the lover's heart just where the epic tetrameter breaks down in iambic dismay. Breaks interrupt time and change its data. Archilochos' written texts break pieces of passing sound off from time and hold them as his own. Breaks make a person think. When I contemplate the physical spaces that articulate the letters "I love you" in a written text, I may be led to think about other spaces, for example, the space that lies between you in the text and you in my life. Both of these kinds of space come into being by an act of symbolization. Both require the mind to reach out from what is present and actual to something else, something glimpsed in the imagination. In letters, as in love, to imagine is to address oneself to what is not. To write words, I put a symbol in place of an absent sound. To write the words "I love you" requires a further, analogous replacement, one that is much more painful in its implication. Your absence from the syntax of my life is not a fact to be changed by written words, and it is the single fact that makes a difference to the lover, the fact that you and I are not one. Archilochos steps off the edge of that fact into extreme solitude. Alphabetic edge. What is so special about the Greek alphabet? Other forms of script, both pictographic and phonetic, were at hand in the ancient world. For example, Assyrian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and various Near Eastern sibyllaries. Yet the Greek alphabet came as a startling novelty and revolutionized the human ability to set down thoughts. How? The Greeks created their alphabet by taking over the syllabic sign system of the Phoenicians and modifying it in certain decisive ways sometime in the early 8th century BC. It is standard to say that their chief modification amounted to, quote, introducing the vowels. Vowels were not expressed in Phoenician writing, although it is possible certain letters were beginning to acquire some vocalic character. But from the outset, the Greek alphabet had 5 vowels in full use. This standard description does no justice, however, to the conceptual leap that distinguishes the Greek alphabet from all other writing systems. Let us look more closely at the unique activity of symbolization made possible when the Greeks devised the original 26 signs of their alphabet. A script that furnishes a true alphabet for a language is one able to symbolize the phonemes of the language exhaustively, unambiguously, and economically. The first and only ancient sign system to do so was the Greek alphabet. Other phonetic systems available to the Greeks, for example, the unvocalized sibyllaries of the North Semitic scripts, or the vocalized syllabary known as Linear B, used by Cretans and Mycenaean Greeks prehistorically, operated on the principle of symbolizing each pronounceable sound of the language with a separate sign. Hundreds of signs were required, each representing a single syllable of vowel plus consonant. In their choice to translate sound into graphic symbol, these scripts represented a decisive advance in the development of writing. But the Greek alphabet took one further notional step. It broke those pronounced units of sound apart into their acoustic components. Vowels come into being. But vowels are inconceivable without a prior dashing innovation. For the components of every linguistic noise are 2. 1, a sound made by a vibration of a column of air in the larynx or nasal cavity as it is expelled past the vocal cords. 2, the starting and stopping of the sound by interaction of the tongue, teeth, palate, lips, and nose. The actions that start and stop sounds, which we think of as consonants, can themselves produce no sound. They are non-sounds having, as Plato said, no voice. The importance of these unutterable symbolic entities called consonants is summarized by one historian this way. What must be stressed is that the act which created the alphabet is an idea, and an act of intellect which, so far as signs for the independent consonants are concerned, is also an act of abstraction from anything an ear can hear or a voice say. For the pure consonant, T, D, K, or whatever, is unpronounceable without adding to it some suggestion of vocalic breath. The Phoenician sign stood for a consonant plus any vowel, the vowel being supplied from context by a reader. The Greek sign, and this for the first time in the history of writing, stands for an abstraction, the isolated consonant. When we think about this remarkable invention of the Greek alphabet and think about how a human mind operates when it uses the alphabet, the remarkable operations of Eros stand forward for comparison. We have already detected an ancient analogy between language and love, implicit in the conception of breath as universal conductor of seductive influences and of persuasive speech. Here at the entrance to written language and literate thinking, we see that analogy revivified by the archaic writers who first ventured to record their poems. The alphabet they use is a unique instrument. Its uniqueness unfolds directly from its power to mark the edges of sound. For, as we have seen, the Greek alphabet is a phonetic system uniquely concerned to represent a certain aspect of the act of speech, namely the starting and stopping of each sound. Consonants are the crucial factor. Consonants mark the edges of sound. The erotic relevance of this is clear, for we have seen that Eros is vitally alert to the edges of things and makes them felt by lovers. As Eros insists upon the edges of human beings and of the spaces between them, the written consonant imposes edge on the sounds of human speech and insists on the reality of that edge, although it has its origin in the reading and writing imagination. This analogy between the nature of Eros and the genius of the Greek alphabet may seem a fanciful one to literate modern judgments. But it seems likely our judgments in this area have been blunted by habit and indifference. We read too much, write too poorly, and remember too little about the delightful discomfort of learning these skills for the first time. Think how much energy, time, and emotion goes into that effort of learning. It absorbs years of your life and dominates your self-esteem. It informs much of your subsequent endeavor to grasp and communicate with the world. Think of the beauty of letters and of how it feels to come to know them. In her autobiography, Eudora Welty confesses her susceptibility to this beauty. My love for the alphabet, which endures, grew out of reciting it, but before that, out of seeing the letters on the page in my own storybooks before I could read them for myself. I fell in love with various winding, enchanted-looking initials drawn by Walter Crane at the heads of fairy tales. In Once Upon a Time, an O had a rabbit running on it as a treadmill, his feet upon flowers. When the day came, years later, for me to see the Book of Kells, all the wizardry of letter, initial, and word swept over me 1,000 times over. And the illumination, the gold, seemed a part of the word's beauty and holiness that had been there from the start. Eudora Welty's delight in beautifully inscribed letters is not, I think, untypical of writers. Pythagoras, a mathematician, is said to have felt a similar aesthetic pressure. He took pains over the beauty of his letters, forming each stroke with a geometrical rhythm of angles and curves and straight lines. To take pains over letters is an experience known to most of us. They are enticing, difficult shapes, and you learn them by tracing the outlines again and again. So also in the ancient world, children learned to write by tracing out the letter forms, as we may judge from a passage in Plato's Protagoras. Just as those who are teaching pupils not yet adept at writing draw in the strokes of the letters in faint outline with the pen for them, then hand them the writing tablet and have them trace over the guidelines. To anyone trained in this way, the edges of letters are memorable, emotional places and remain so. We can see how powerfully these alphabetic outlines struck the eyes and minds of people grappling with them for the first time in the ancient Greek context. There are several scenes from ancient tragedy where such an encounter is dramatized. The most extensive is a fragment of Euripides' Theseus. An illiterate man is looking out to the sea and spies a ship with writing on it. He reads, "I'm not skilled at letters, but I will explain the shapes and clear symbols to you. There's a circle marked out, as it were, with a compass, and it has a clear sign in the middle. The second one is first of all 2 strokes, and then another one, keeping them apart in the middle. The third is curly like a lock of hair, and the fourth is 1 line going straight up and 3 crosswise ones attached to it. The fifth is not easy to describe. There are 2 strokes, which run together from separate points to one support. And the last one is like the third." The man had spelled out the 6 letters of the name Theseus. It must have been a scene that proved dramatically effective, for 2 other tragedians imitated it very closely, as our extant fragments show. Sophocles is said to have staged a satire play in which, or satyr play, in which an actor danced the letters of the alphabet. The Athenian comic playwright Callias produced something known as the Alphabetic Review, in which the 24 members of the chorus acted out the letters of the alphabet and imitated syllables by dancing in pairs of vowel plus consonant. Presumably, some considerable proportion of the audience at these plays could participate in the fascination and chagrin of tracing out alphabetic shapes. Perhaps they had practiced it themselves when learning letters. Perhaps they had been daunted by the task and never learned letters. Perhaps they listened to their children complaining about it at the dinner table every night. In any event, the people to whom such theater appealed were people whose imaginations could be seized by the spectacle of grammata, taking shape in air as if they were real. These are vividly pictorial imaginations, and they evidently take some pleasure in the plastic contours of the alphabet. If we give some consideration to ancient writing as a physical production, we see the same imagination at work. The Greeks plainly regarded their alphabet as a set of pictorial devices. Through the 6th century BC, they used for their inscriptions the continuous to and fro style of writing known as boustrophaedon, so named because it turns at the end of each line and comes back along the furrow as the ox turns with the plow. All the letters in the odd-numbered lines would face in one direction, and those in even-numbered lines in the opposite direction. Writing this way was made easier for the Greek writer by the fact that, of the 26 shapes available to them, 12 were symmetrical, 6 required very little change in reversal, and only 8 looked markedly different backward. Such a style suggests a writer who thinks of his letters as a series of novel reversible shapes, a Greek way of thinking about letters. Greek society does not seem to have borrowed this style from any other system of writing. Its adoption, says L.H. Jeffrey, implies simply a pictorial conception of the letters as outline figures which can be turned in either direction according to need. Attentiveness to outline in early Greek writers is apparent not only at the level of individual letters, but also in the approach to groups of words and lines of text. It is a notable feature of archaic inscriptions that they frequently mark divisions between word groups with patterns of dots set one atop another in small columns of 2, 3, or 6. This practice died out in classical times as writers and readers became blasé about their power to impose or deny edges. Some care is also given in early inscriptions to demarcating whole lines of text. And this is not merely an accident of the boustrophaedon style, where alternate lines are distinguished by the direction of the writing. Even after this style had given way almost everywhere to a consistent left-to-right script by the 5th century, writers continued to approximate the distinction with alternating colors of ink. Stone-cut letters, too, were at times colored with paint in alternate lines of red and black. Some aesthetic attraction is the motive adduced by epigraphists for such peculiarities, but we should take note of the particular mode of the aesthetic. In writing, beauty prefers an edge. Nor should we disregard the implements and materials of ancient writing. They wrote on stone, wood, metal, leather, ceramics, waxed tablets, and papyrus. By the 5th century, papyrus was the accepted medium, and the Greeks took their word for book from biblos, papyrus plants. Papyrus, both the material itself and the idea of writing on it, came originally from Gebal in Phoenicia and later from Egypt. But the Greeks did not use papyrus in the same way as the Egyptians or Phoenicians did. Instead, they rethought the activity and redesigned the materials as they had done when they took over the Phoenician sign system and transformed it into the world's first alphabet. A radical innovation was introduced. For use on papyrus, Greek writers devised the pen. The Egyptians wrote with the stem of a rush. Its ends were cut in a slant and chewed to create a fine brush-like tool. With this soft brush, the Egyptian writer painted rather than wrote his letters, producing a thick and often uneven band of ink that left forked trails wherever it was lifted. Greek writers devised a pen out of the stiff, hollow reed called kalamos. It was sharpened to a point with a knife and split at the top. This reed pen produced a fine line without raggedness where the pen was lifted. But if the hand stops still for a moment, either in beginning or finishing a stroke, a little round blob of ink collects, warns papyrologist E.G. Turner. The reed pen would seem to be a tool expressly designed for keeping the edges of letters cleanly demarcated. It is also a tool whose user must pay attention to exactly where he wants to stop and start each letter stroke. Blobs of ink mar the quality of the written product as well as the enjoyment of producing it. Expertise tells at the edge. There is the juncture of a writer's pleasure, risk, and pain. It is arguable then, from the way they wrote and the tools they used, that ancient readers and writers conceived the Greek alphabet as a system of outlines or edges. But let us penetrate beyond the physical procedure of their writing to the activity of mind that informs it. It is an activity of symbolization. Being a phonetic system, the Greek alphabet is concerned to symbolize not objects in the real world, but the very process in which sounds act to construct speech. Phonetic script imitates the activity of discourse itself. The Greek alphabet revolutionized this imitative function through introduction of its consonant, which is a theoretic element, and abstraction. The consonant functions by means of an active imagination in the mind of the user. I am writing this book because that act astounds me. It is an act in which the mind reaches out from what is present and actual to something else. The fact that Eros operates by means of an analogous act of imagination will soon be seen to be the most astounding thing about Eros. I'm going to back up a minute. But let us penetrate beyond the physical procedure of their writing to the activity of mind that informs it. So we've thought about what it means to physically write for them using their pens, split reed pens. So let's think about what's going on in the mind when they're doing that. The activity of mind that's happening while they write is an activity of symbolization. Being a phonetic system, the Greek alphabet is concerned to symbolize not objects in the real world, but the very process in which sounds act to construct speech. Because we don't have pictures. This is not hieroglyphics. It's an alphabet based on sounds and sound combinations. Because of that, it is always already symbolic. You know that the letter B, L-A-M-E, Those letters separately like don't mean anything themselves. And frankly, those letters together don't mean anything themselves. They are a symbol of either the noun blame, placing blame on someone, or the verb like to blame. But BLAME like isn't that. It isn't depicting that. It is a phonetic symbol, a sound symbol based on letter combinations of that concept. Phonetic script imitates the activity of discourse itself, because when you're thinking about that word BLAME as a symbol for a concept, you're already, in order to make that work, you are involved in an internal dialogue between like the letters that you recognize separately, like as letters, the letters that you recognize together as the concept or as the symbol, and then the idea that we have attached to that set of letters that makes the symbol, right? So you're going through this like internal like discourse, like an internal, well, I don't know if I call it a dialectic, but at least an active internal discourse. The Greek alphabet revolutionized this imitative function through introduction of its consonant, which is a theoretic element and abstraction. The consonant functions by means of an act of imagination in the mind of the user. The Greek alphabet revolutionized this imitative function through introduction of its consonant as like something capable of standing on its own. And as she was talking about before, like you can't make a sound of a consonant by itself. Even if we pronounce like one consonant, we are pronouncing, like we name each of those consonants, the sounds of those consonants exist as a combination with a vowel sound. If you were going to try to use letters to tell someone how to pronounce or how to name a letter, how to say the name of a letter, that is a consonant. Like if we're gonna go with BLAME again, because it's written on a piece of paper over here beside my computer. It's the first thing I saw. The word, the B is like, I would tell you to pronounce the name of the letter B by saying, it sounds like B-E, B. L, same thing, E-L. A is its own sound because it's a vowel. M is E-M, and then E after the end is a vowel. So it has its own sound in its name and it only depends on itself. So the Greek alphabet revolutionized this imitative function through introduction of its consonant, which is a theoretic element and abstraction. The consonant functions by means of an act of imagination in the mind of the user. We have to know, anyway, we'll keep going. I am writing this book because that act astounds me. It is an act in which the mind reaches out from what is present and actual to something else. The fact that Eros operates by means of an analogous act of imagination will soon be seen to be the most astounding thing about Eros. Okay, that's a lot. That's just 2 chapters, chapter 9 and chapter 10. Really though, Archilochos at the edge and Alphabetic edge. So we will pick up next time, whenever that next time is, with one of my favorite chapters called What Does the Lover Want from Love? Until then.